the extraterrestrial scouts' mission, which held the burden of intergalactic dominion, brought them to Earth. Thought of Earth as a primitive culture that was light years ahead in terms of technology, intelligence, and combat tactics. They arrived with advanced surveillance gear and concealing gadgets, making the challenge nearly ludicrous. Their attitude was one of arrogant superiority, and they were able to destroy any planetary defense they could come across, feeling that the people of Earth were merely a minor obstacle to their plans to grow their empire. In order to watch unnoticed, the scouts landed in a secluded woodland location that was selected due to its lack of human activity. Evaluate the planet's defenses and report that the surroundings were placid, even welcoming. As they scanned the soft foliage and towering trees, they saw wildlife moving through the shadows. Charming planet that was brimming with life but completely devoid of sophistication. The scouts confidently moved. Their sensors were used at every stage to scan the landscape and identify any possible hazards, but none were discovered, which only strengthened their disdain for this primitive planet. And as they collected information, their discussions devolved into ridiculing one scout, pointed to a nearby human-made building that could be seen in the distance, a crude lookout tower that appeared to. They giggled at the fact that it was almost ludicrous in comparison to their sleek future ships. A ridiculousness of stealth ships and wooden barriers against plasma weapons, Scout mockingly remarked, this was a planet that hadn't learned the fundamentals of warfare yet. Their laughing reverberated through the trees, suggesting that the humans could attempt to repel them with slingshots and arrows. With a tone of contempt that verged on conceit, their apparatus exposed Earth's past of confrontations. The scouts examined tactics, weaponry, and war plans from ages ago. They mocked what they saw as haphazard and ineffective methods of fighting land-based conflicts. Even Earth's nuclear arsenal appeared trivial to them, as did riches and beliefs. The precision and potency of the most sophisticated weapons that humanity had created paled in comparative proportion to their own. Technology. The scouts came to the conclusion that people on Earth depended more on brute force than intelligence. The scouts' derision, which solidified their sense of superiority, went beyond Earth's warfare. To the people themselves, they watched footage of farmers caring for each other. The simplicity of these activities, children playing in fields, agricultural laborers constructing homes, and strengthened their belief that humans are a species constrained by routine. They were unable to imagine how a species so focused on everyday survival could ever be a threat to them. The scouts started to transmit, since they thought it was ridiculous that people could resist. Their discoveries on their home planet, their reports were replete with contemptuous comments and evaluations of given Earth's negligible defensive potential. They suggested a swift and forceful invasion, forecasting that the little Earth was given to them with little effort and almost little loss. Conquest that would increase their dominion without posing any problems gave them such faith that they even joked that their less experienced members would use the invasion as a training exercise or experience warriors. But their haughtiness had repercussions for their contemptuous analysis. They overlooked factors that were not able to be measured by sensors or condensed into reports. The faint, nearly undetectable indications that someone is seeing them, shadows shifting strangely, and an abrupt silence in reaction, they disregarded the nearby fauna and weak sounds that didn't correspond with their environmental data as unimportant. They were too preoccupied with their own story to think about the potential, knowing they were being watched, evaluated in exchange. Their apparatus kept scanning the region in search of energy signatures, patterns, or anything else that might be worth mentioning for each negative. The outcome appeared to support their theories, according to which the ecosystem of Earth is an open book with every experience. Their technology had revealed a secret, and they found it absurd that anything could elude their scans. They had never experienced a scenario in which their tools malfunctioned, and they refused to consider the idea that this could be the first. And as the hours went by, the scouts turned into seconds. As they moved more casually, they turned off some systems. Thinking they weren't needed in such a low-risk setting, they ventured farther into the forest to list the plants and fauna. While continuing their contemptuous remarks, they conjectured on how they believed that Earth had already been subjugated and that its resources could be taken and used to build their empire. Despite their bluster, the humans were unaware that there was a subtle irony in their actions. For all the scouts' strategic acumen and technological superiority were clearly lacking. Overconfidence. They were too preoccupied with mocking Earth's alleged flaws to notice their own weaknesses. And their conceit kept them from adopting simple safety measures, such as communicating, which gets intertwined with their part of the story. Several of them mirrored this conceit as they spoke dismissively and confidently. Any cautionary advice as superfluous, they made fun of the humans' need on antiquated methods like Jean Jachat. For them, guerrilla warfare and camouflage were remnants of a less philosophizing era. They couldn't fathom that such techniques might be successful against evolved time. Thus, they weren't worth considering. As they started to put together their final report, their derision of their advanced powers peaked, suggested quick action, and provided a detailed invasion plan based on zero opposition. They planned a quick operation in which their armies would overrun Earth in a few days. The report was replete with patronizing rhetoric, portraying Earth as an unprotected treasure and its people as... The scouts believed that because they were unsophisticated creatures, incapable of effective resistance. Quote, one scout's comment as they were ready to submit the report summed up their mindset as he observed the surrounding forest, saying, "This place is beautiful, but it's wasted on them soon." The others chuckled in agreement, their minds already shifting past the current task. Although they didn't understand that the beauty they disregarded as wasted was actually the secret to defeating the aliens' haughtiness. Scouts' disdain for Earth was evident, and they felt they were untouchably superior in every manner, although their arrogance prevented them from seeing the reality, and as they ridiculed Earth's strategies, they overlooked the fact that the very activities that disdained simplicity, which could surpass them because they had undervalued not just the Earth, but additionally the resourcefulness and fortitude of its defenders, who were unaware that their mission was going to take an unexpected. Contrary, the hunters who lived in trees on Earth were an exception, the result of centuries of development, molded by the severity of the habitat. These hunters flourished in their surroundings. In contrast to the alien scouts' regimented and highly analytical style, their capacity to adapt, their intuition, and their close relationship with their environment made them a species that had long mastered working in the background. Their very presence is evidence of the tenacity and resourcefulness that these hunters were neither human nor animal in the usual sense, having been fostered by the Earth for millennia. But a composite intelligence that had developed in the harshest environments on Earth ecosystems. They didn't require sophisticated technology or intricate weapons. They depended on nature's tools, which are home to deadly precision. For many generations' strength was their capacity to blend in with their surroundings and become inconspicuous. Not their moves were planned, but executed using cloaking technologies and a thorough knowledge of their terrain. Fluid. They knew every tree and every step was a conscious act of survival. Every secret trail in their territory was a branch, and their understanding of the forest could not be downloaded. When scanned, it was experienced firsthand and transmitted through complex behavioral patterns. This ingrained familiarity provided them with a competitive edge that no cutting-edge technology could match. They were more than just forest dwellers. They were an extension of the forest, contributing to its ecology in the same way that the soil and air do. What set these hunters distinct was their capacity for strategic planning without the need of sophisticated instruments, which they had perfected. While patiently waiting for the ideal moment to arrive for hours or even days, They used nonverbal cues like tiny posture changes, gestures, and even breathing adjustments to communicate. Patterns. This degree of coordination enabled them to function as a unified, coherent entity without requiring whether it was centralized control or hierarchical directives. They instinctively knew what each person needed to perform. Functioning as both a separate entity and a component of the greater collective, their presence was mostly unknown to the humans in the outside world, in their busy cities and villages, have long since ceased. These hunters had evaded discovery in the depths of Earth's untamed wilderness, not on purpose, concealment, but because to the human predisposition to ignore things that don't appear important to them, engaging with people, and since people had no motive to seek them out, their anonymity had enabled them to grow independently, unhindered by outside forces, and refine their strategies for defense and survival. Alongside Earth's numerous predators, hunters have developed the ability to not only protect themselves, but also to turn the tables on those that posed a threat, and they eventually evolved into apex predators rather than in the wielders themselves. They realized that power rested not in physical might, but in unparalleled strategy and cunning. Engaging with people, and since people had no motive to seek them out, their anonymity had enabled them to grow independently, unhindered by outside forces, and refine their strategies for defense and survival. Alongside Earth's numerous predators, hunters have developed the ability to not only protect themselves, but also to turn the tables on those that posed a threat, and they eventually evolved into apex predators rather than in the wielders themselves. They realized that power rested not in physical might, but in unparalleled strategy and cunning. This idea influenced all of their actions, not so much in controlling their surroundings as in balancing them. They considered themselves not as capable of hunting prey or protecting their territory from intruders, conquerors, but as guardians, defending their ecosystem's equilibrium from all dangers. Their conflict resolution strategy was founded on deception and subtlety. If it could be prevented, they would never engage an adversary directly. Instead, they used the environment as a shield and a lure to trick their enemies into falling into traps. Weapon. A fallen branch could turn into a deadly trap, a thin stream could hide a cliff, and their territory was Each piece of the labyrinth of natural defenses is intended to confound and incapacitate, or get rid of intruders. The woodland may appear tranquil to an outsider. Even despite its seclusion, it was a live, breathing fortress to the hunters. Hunters had witnessed humanity's encroachment on their world, and they were well aware of the wider problems threatening it. Their land and the slow deterioration of Earth's natural processes. They had seen the emergence of earthquakes, but despite not having the resources to completely understand technology and its effects on the environment, they realized that they needed to change their strategies to meet these new obstacles. So they started incorporating these adjustments into their tactics, utilizing their profound knowledge of nature to offset the disturbances brought by human activities. The hunters detected the extraterrestrial scouts' presence well before any human or Cassian forest itself might have appeared to respond to the immigrants' rhythms through a sophisticated detecting system. Having been changed by their entrance, the hunters watch from a distance, their keen senses and keen eyes capturing things that even the advanced scanners of the aliens failed to detect. The scouts' movements, conduct, and the subtle indications of their technology, they were able to identify the aliens as a threat without having to comprehend the goal of their mission. The hunters started to get ready, not hastily but carefully, modifying their routines and creating new traps and altering previous ones to take into consideration this new adversary. They researched the aliens' behavior, spotting flaws in their patterns and movements, and relying on alien studies. As technology advanced and their ignorance of the hunters' presence became apparent, this dependence was a weakness. While the scouts trusted their tools, the hunters trusted a weakness they knew they could take advantage of. As they watched, the hunters' instincts picked up on something that the aliens themselves were unaware of due to their conceit. With an air of invincibility and self-assurance in their superiority, the scouts advanced into the woodland. Departing, they disregarded the forest as a primitive, unthreatening setting, exposing them. The scouts were able to forecast their patterns with ease, since they were unable to see the danger concealed inside this arrogance, anticipate and thwart the hunters' attempts to penetrate the aliens' seeming invincibility, that a lack of regard for one's own rights could not be made up for by even the most sophisticated technology. The hunting approach was developed out of necessity rather than malice, and they viewed themselves as guardians who had no interest in conquest, protecting their land and way of life from an invading force, or expansion. Their sole objective was to maintain the ecosystem's equilibrium, which served as their scarf. Every move gives the alien scouts, who are overconfident and uncoordinated, clarity and focus. Could never match in the end. The hunters' advantage came from their connectedness to their surroundings. They were actively transforming the battlefield, transforming the woodland into an area that was not just a reaction to the aliens' presence. Erratic and deadly labyrinth, they realized that their power relied not on their own skills, but instead on their unity. Their greatest weapon was their grasp of the world, and their unity, which allowed them to blend in seamlessly, a force that was impossible to imitate or counter by technology. As the hunters got ready for what was ahead, they did so with the silent resolve of a race that had endured innumerable challenges. They merely operated in accordance with their principles, without underestimating their adversary or overestimating themselves. The instincts and knowledge that had kept them silent for generations carried the burden of Earth's unbridled tenacity, prepared to face whatever danger that the aliens could encounter. With their senses dimmed by overconfidence, the scouts advanced farther into the forest. Instruments checked the area, confirming that there are no indications of an imminent threat. They were untouchable because, to their technology, which eliminated any possible threats before they might emerge, but their instruments were unable to identify what was concealed since it was much outside the range of their sensors. Estimations, the area they had written off as a straightforward forest, turned out to be a battlefield that had been painstakingly sculpted by its altars. As the aliens advanced, the defenders' route grew increasingly narrow. The tall trees appeared to be in sympathy with this wanderer, providing him with light and shade from the cloudless sky, obstructing sunlight and enclosing the region in perpetual twilight. In addition to being a natural feature, the thick foliage served as a well-maintained shield that reduced the uneven ground, made it difficult to see, and made advanced optics all but worthless. The scouts started to slow their progress because of the natural barriers created by the thick roots and vines. Pace became uncomfortable but refused to acknowledge their weakness, so they choked up the subtle traps started to take place as a result of primitive natural forces' inability to understand the deliberate purpose behind them. One scout's weight caused a portion of earth that appeared to be firm to give way, sending them plummeting into a hum. Another scout discovered that their movement was impeded by vines that appeared in a shallow trench that was expertly disguised with greenery. Commonplace, but had been thoughtfully placed to trap intruders. They weren't haphazard. Events were the consequence of the forest's defenders, the aliens, carefully planning them, yet mistook these occurrences for environmental dangers and dismissed them as small setbacks instead of acknowledging their impact. As they progressed, the scouts' strategic aim increased their dependence on them. Technology is trying to adjust its instruments to account for the forest disturbance, but this dependence merely increased their susceptibility and their attention to their. Because gadgets diverted their attention from their environment, they were more vulnerable to manipulation, and their communication became chaotic. As they found it difficult to adjust, their voices became strained with frustration. Unaware that their equipment wasn't malfunctioning, but rather was just not suitable, they started to doubt its dependability. The initial concerted onslaught was unexpected due to the intricacy of their surroundings. The scouts were unable to understand their cloaking gadgets as the woodland burst into action, flashed when their systems were damaged by electromagnetic disturbances. The defenders had taken advantage of the natural distortions that defenders had failed to notice, the electromagnetic fields of the landscape, which caused a disruption that left the objects flying high in the air but were still on impact. Before they could respond, aliens briefly revealed their glistening shape silhouetted against the woods. Numerous missiles made of stone and sharpened wood impacted their targets. These unrefined but efficient weapons were directed toward their armor's weak spots, which the hunters had carefully determined. Seeing that their training had not prepared them, the scouts frantically tried to regain their composure. They prepared them for this type of conflict since they were accustomed to dealing with adversaries who were technologically sophisticated, rather than those who used the environment as a weapon. And the forest's natural features prevented them from launching a counterattack. Even nuclear weapons and plasma blasts were unable to pass through the thick flora, disintegrating innocuously against their biggest challenge was now the trees, the very area they had written off as primitive. Panic set in as the scouts saw that they were out of control and that their tactical advantage was meaningless against an adversary who, the hunters moved with precision, hitting quickly and withdrawing into the shadows when they refused to fight on their terms. Before the aliens could strike back, the scouts encountered opposition at every turn, not in the shape of direct conflict, but after a never-ending string of little, well-planned blows. They found themselves outwitted at every opportunity, their self-assurance fading with every second of communication between the scouts. It became disorganized. Its commander made an effort to keep things in order by giving orders and attempting to devise a plan. But the alien force lacked the unity required to adjust to such a volatile adversary. Their training focused on using overwhelming force to establish control, a tactic that was ineffective in this setting. Defenders of forests were not your typical foes. They knew the terrain well enough to use every element of the surroundings to their advantage, going beyond maps or sensors. The scouts' equipment once. Their greatest strength turned into a weakness as their over-reliance on technology hindered their mobility and restricted their capacity to adapt. While the hunters relied only on their senses and a keen understanding of the jungle, they didn't require advanced communication systems or centralized leadership hierarchies. Their unity sprang from a common goal and an instinctive knowledge of their individual duties. Hunter worked with the others in unison while acting autonomously, resulting in a fluid and unexpected style of where aliens' inability to fight back caused the scouts to retreat gradually. They made an unsuccessful attempt to reorganize in order to reevaluate and adjust. Every action they took was foreseen, and every strategy was thwarted before it could be carried out, so the hunters didn't need. Their strength was in their ability to exploit others with precision and patience, not in using force or overwhelming numbers. Every vulnerability the scouts found was defended out of need rather than out of rage or hatred. Area with the same quiet resolve that had kept them going for generations. And the last blow didn't come as a one major blow, but rather as the result of innumerable minor triumphs. The scouts' morale was destroyed, their equipment broke, and they were cut off from one another. They had undervalued the forest and its protectors, supposing them to be archaic, and the hunters didn't care because they had sealed their own fate in doing so. Commemorate their triumph, they just vanished into the jungle, leaving no evidence of their existence there. As though nothing had occurred, the alien scouts, wounded and dejected, barely managed to return to their regular rhythm. Their mission was a failure because of their conceit, which prevented them from seeing their enemy's actual nature. Arrive on Earth anticipating a simple conquest, only to discover that they are outmatched by an incomprehensible force. The forest and its protectors had demonstrated that sophistication and power were not always determined by technology, or, sometimes, true power was found in the capacity to adapt, endure, and adapt again, but always ready to learn from that and to come back for more. Still visible, the alien scouts, now confused and scattered, started to run away. Upon re-evaluating their circumstances, they discovered that their technical superiority had not only did they not have an advantage, but they were also exposed because they had misjudged the Earth's defenders' intelligence and adaptation, which they still found difficult to understand, made the forest appear to be alive. For the first time, the scouts had to face the unseen invaders as both an ally and an adversary. Their attempts to recover control of the situation were hindered by the limitations of their technology and comprehension, by the exact instruments they had so heavily depended on, their sophisticated systems, which were intended to evaluate intricate situations and offer useful insights. But they were unable to make sense of they purchased this randomness, but it was anything but that was a well-planned tactic that took advantage of the scouts' reliance on linear reasoning and predictability. Defenders were more adaptable than technology, changing their tactics in real time to match every move the scouts forced the aliens to switch their strategy from offensive to defensive as they battled to defend themselves against an attacker. Unfortunately, they were unable to see or predict their energy reserves, which were intended to keep them going. Long-term operations started to decline as a result of the constant countermeasures they had to. Conserved resources by reducing the amount of weapons and defenses they used, much more vulnerable because their assailants appeared to have limitless vitality derived from the very brink of timidity of suicidal urge. The scouts' psychological toll was severe because they were used to being in an environment that they had rejected as primitive. The dominant force in every interaction, they now had to deal with a danger that went against their training and expectations. In contrast, the hunters' fear was evident in their haphazard decision-making and fragmented communication, shown no symptoms of stress. Instead, every action was well thought out and effective, driven by a thorough comprehension of their obstacles. The scouts' confidence was further damaged by the sharp contrast between their opponent and their surroundings, leaving them exposed not only to the scouts, tried to reorganize, but their attempts were consistently thwarted, both mentally and physically. Hunters used an attrition-based approach, gradually wearing out their adversaries with a relentless string of tiny, accurate shots. The aliens' armor, which was made to withstand high-energy strikes, was not appropriate for the simple but efficient attacks. Projectiles that the hunters used to target vulnerable areas that they had carefully identified often came to multiple siege before punishing all hostages and doing a lot of harm. In a last-ditch effort to flee, the scouts were compelled to leave their post and retreat deeper into the forest. The forest was transformed into a maze that the scouts were unable to navigate due to the hunters' skillful utilization of the landscape. The scouts had to traverse every tree, shadow, and sound that could pose a threat. Human witnesses announced that they were seeing strange things in the forest and wondering if they were setting themselves up for failure. Because the hunters altered the landscape to make false trails and dead ends, mapping the terrain proved to be hard. The forest appeared to change all around them, incorporating its organic elements into the hunters' arsenal. The scouts' advanced outfits, which were previously a sign of their dominance, broke under the psychological strain. It became a hardship as they found it difficult to maneuver through the thick foliage that their weapons were made to. In the close quarters of the forest, long-range combat was ineffective. The hunters, conversely, they moved effortlessly with their little armor and lightweight weaponry, which were ideal for their surroundings. They didn't require energy-based weaponry or sophisticated targeting systems because they knew the terrain. Despite their increasing desperation, the scouts refused to give up their pride, even though the opponent's deficiencies were sufficient weapons. And even though the odds were stacked against them, they tried once since their training required them to fight until the end. Final stand, mobilizing all of their remaining assets in a desperate attempt to reverse the trend, they engaged in every defensive system they used to construct a temporary fortress and a clearing that they thought could be defended. But the hunters, who were expecting this action, have previously readied themselves for it. They launched a swift and decisive attack on the clearing, hiding their approach from the scouts by using the forest. The hunter hit with precision practically before the onslaught started, and they were undetected when it started. Focusing on and mercilessly destroying the scouts' remaining defenses, the hunters melted back into the clearing, which the scouts had considered their last hope, and ultimately defeated them. Woodland as swiftly as they had emerged, leaving the scouts demoralized and unable to continue. The scouts' gradual humiliation during their retreat from the forest, shining suits were beaten and burned, their weapons were exhausted, their self-esteem was destroyed, and they were no longer. Instead, they staggered into the woodland with the confidence and haughtiness that had signaled their approach. When prey were escaping a predator, the unseen defenders trailed their every move. The forest was once a simple and living thing. Their mission's backdrop had turned into a representation of their failure when they eventually emerged from the trees and made their journey. The scouts had come to Earth expecting an easy journey, but on the way back to their ship, they had more questions than answers. Triumph, a simple task that would prove their prowess. But instead, they had faced a force beyond their comprehension that had humbled them in ways they never would have thought possible. Being outwitted, outfought, and outmaneuvered by a species they had written off as primitive, the lesson was, despite their reluctance to admit it, it was evident that the scouts' failure was more than a failure of strategy or technology, but more of the way they had perceived the world. And through the prism of their own supremacy, its defenders were oblivious to the advantages inherent in their own simplicity. They were ridiculed for underestimating their opponent, and, in doing so, the value of flexibility. Tenacity and solidarity, the hunters did not rejoice in their triumph or chase the escaping scouts. They just went back to their lives, knowing their objective all along. Fulfilled for them, the fight was about surviving and protecting their lives, rather than about conquering or getting revenge. At home, they had protected their region using their own tools, rather than cutting-edge technology, surroundings, and their own resourcefulness. They demonstrated that strength was not a function of sophistication, but of comprehension, and bonding the extraterrestrial scouts, thrashed and humiliated, departed from Earth with a tale they would find difficult to justify their purpose. Had failed, but it also taught us about the limitations of technology and the perils of conceit. The memory of a planet that had defied them was carried with them when they returned to their homeworld. The alien and scouts had learned the true meaning of strength from their defenders. Despite being beaten and humiliated, they were able to leave the jungle and make it to their ship, which was the next step to safety. Was characterized by quiet, their previously arrogant assurance replaced by an implicit recognition of their had failed. But it also taught us about the limitations of technology and the perils of conceit. The memory of a planet that had defied them was carried with them when they returned to their homeworld. The alien and scouts had learned the true meaning of strength from their defenders. Despite being beaten and humiliated, they were able to leave the jungle and make it to their ship, which was the next step to safety. Was characterized by quiet, their previously arrogant assurance replaced by an implicit recognition of their disaster. The mission that started with the hope of a swift and decisive victory came to an abrupt end as a reminder of the shortcomings and their presumptions that their technological expertise and conceit had not been adequate. As they rallied and got ready to depart, they faced a foe they had never completely comprehended. The scouts had to report their initial impressions to their superiors, which was a difficult assignment, which had made fun of the Earth's seeming defenselessness and its people's imagined primitivism, suddenly seemed exceedingly accurate. The conceit that had directed their mission planning had been shallow and lacking, and it had not only blinded them to the planet's actual nature, while simultaneously making them susceptible to strategies they had written off as irrelevance. The scouts' defeat overshadowed their report, which had before been full of arrogance. In their final analysis, they outlined an adversary that represented their newfound comprehension of Earth's defenders. was able to defeat a superior force while lacking both traditional organization and modern technology. The idea of adaptability, togetherness, and close awareness of their surroundings was one that scouts found it difficult to explain because it went against the measurements and categories that had outlined their methodology for. Conflict, they were unable to classify the defenders' strategies or measure their power, but they were unable to deny their efficacy. One of the scouts' most important insights was the significance of humility in comprehension. An adversary, their conceit had kept them from seeing the forest's potential, and its residents, who failed to recognize the simplicity of their surroundings as a source of strength. This mistake had been the cause of their demise, and it was a lesson that had far-reaching effects. It called into question the very basis of their strategy for exploration and conquest, compelling them to challenge their beliefs about what power and superiority meant. As the scouts also vanquished, highlighted the drawbacks of depending only on technology. Their sophisticated systems have been created to combat dangers posed by other advanced civilizations, rather than by settings that functioned on a completely distinct level of the universe. That end sparked an interesting debate with our episode feature via email. Our group managed to capture the most insightful scientists from everywhere in the world, and they had incisive debates with the scientists in charge of the programming. Glaring reminder that even the most advanced technology was not perfect, and that achievement frequently relied on the hunter's capacity to see beyond the limitations of their own systems in the wake of the encounter was really different, and they went back to their lives without any formalities or festivities. Their victory was just another chapter in their lengthy survival narrative they had struggled to protect rather than to gain fame or credit. Their home and way of life, and their actions were motivated by necessity or introspection, rather than a desire for conquest. Their power was not in their abilities, but rather in their strong ties to their surroundings and their place within them, to rule, but their capacity to persevere and modify the hunter's strategy in times of conflict was evidence of the strength of communes in the playwright's strike. They were resilient and resourceful, and they didn't use advanced weapons or overwhelming force, but based on a thorough comprehension of their environment and their adversaries, their strategy, despite its seeming primitivism, demonstrated to be significantly more successful than the scouts' reliance on linear approach. It showed that the capacity to make the most of one's surroundings was frequently a sign of actual power. Potential to transform perceived shortcomings into unanticipated benefits, the interaction between the technology and intelligences of uncompromising oppositions. The Hunters was more than just a conflict between opposing forces. Rather, it was a meeting of essentially disparate scouts' ideologies, which placed a strong focus on control and superiority, undervalued flexibility and modesty. In contrast, the Hunters had accepted their limits and used them as a basis for their power. This difference emphasized how crucial perspective and conflict understanding are, and emphasized the risks of underestimating a rival based on assumptions the scouts have about them, concluded their mission, but the lessons they took away will have an impact much beyond Earth. Their failure acted as a warning story, or a reminder that power wasn't always derived from firepower or technology, but rather from their society had to reconsider how it approached exploration and conquest in order to comprehend and respect it. Contemplate the importance of humility, flexibility, and venturing into the unknown. The experience compelled them to face their own prejudices and constraints, creating the foundation for a possible change in their. Though the great majority of people were unaware of it, the Scouts' retreat was a silent triumph for Earth. Its citizens, the defenders of the world, have demonstrated their tenacity not by force or power, but they had demonstrated through their perseverance and planning that despite the enormous odds, it was feasible to prevail by being aware of one's advantages and disadvantages and making the most of them. Not only evidence of their own skills, but also of the unrealized potential of the planet. The woodland that served as the battleground for this conflict returned to its natural state and rhythms, unfazed by what had transpired inside its depths. It stood as a silent testament to the strength of oneness and adaptability, serves as a reminder that the most remarkable qualities in the world are frequently found in the most unlikely locations. Hunters who had battled to keep it safe became part of its history. Their deeds continued the equilibrium they had worked to protect. The extraterrestrial scouts, who were now far from Earth and brought with them the recollection of a planet that had disappointed them, which they found difficult to describe, experienced to describe how their culture was overtaken by a power they had written off as unimportant, had always associated superiority and power with strength, suddenly had to reconcile this failure with theirs. Despite its reluctance and incompleteness, the Scouts' report indicated that a new definition of strength was required. Someone who appreciated flexibility, modesty, and reverence for the unknown. Even though the experience was brief, it left a lasting impression on the hunters, demonstrated to the Scouts their ties to their surroundings and their capacity to protect them. It was a humbling reminder of their knowledge gaps and the perils of conceit. It was a lesson that went beyond the details of the fight, that shed light on the nature of strength and perseverance and the significance of seeing the world from a wider perspective. The tale of the tree-dwelling hunters and the extraterrestrial scouts was ultimately more than a mechanical process in a complex, manifolded new world. It was a beautiful story, told quietly for the confirmed tone of a confrontation, but a mirror of the more profound realities of existence. And comprehending it brought out the need of finding power and simplicity in oneness, of accepting the unexpected, and of honoring the unknown.